Okay, we've got a market that's stable in equilibrium. Price is P0, and at that price, quantity demanded equals quantity supplied equals Q0, and so the market's stable. Nothing's going to change unless something happens to shift supply or demand, unless one of those things besides price that affects how much people want to supply or affects how much people want to buy changes. So in this case, we're going to call this the market for laptop computers, and what has happened is that there's some new technology. I'm not good with computer technology, but something happened that made it less costly to produce. So something happened to one of the components in the computer or the way that they're produced, and it's just cheaper for everyone now to produce laptops. And so because of this advancement in technology, costs have fallen. So the first thing we say when we're looking at a change in equilibrium is that a demand shifter or a supply shifter? And a decrease in production costs, we know that's a supply shifter. It's going to increase supply. People are going to be more willing to supply at every price. An increase in supply is a shift out of the supply curve. A shift out, saying that at every price, people are willing to supply more. So at a price of P0, they used to be willing to supply Q0. Now they're willing to buy something bigger than that. Remember, moving along the horizontal axis, moving out is to bigger quantities. And so we've got this new supply curve. People are more willing to supply at every price. That shift out, that's an increase in supply, an increased willingness to supply. It does confuse people sometimes when you're first learning it because it looks like the supply curve is moving down. And so you kind of feel like, oh, well, decrease. But think of it as an increased willingness to supply. It's not costing me as much, so I'm going to be willing to make more at every price. Or yes, for any quantity, you don't have to pay me as much as you used to. You don't have to pay me as much because my costs are lower. So an increased willingness to supply at every price, or an increased willingness to supply at lower prices. It's just a shift out. It's an expansion of supply. And so because of that, more people willing to supply at every price. At that original equilibrium price, you can see at that original price, more people are willing to supply. Quantity supplied is bigger than it used to be. Quantity demanded is still the same. So we've got a surplus at that original equilibrium price. There's going to be downward pressure on price. And so price gets bid down. Price starts to decrease because there's more units available than people want to buy at the original price. So price starts to fall. As price starts to fall, more people are willing to buy. We don't have to shift the demand curve to show that. We know that because the demand curve is downward sloping. The law of demand. As price is falling, the quantity demanded is increasing. So that shift in supply is driving price down. And as price gets driven down, the quantity demanded is increasing. So people were more willing to supply. That drove price down. The decrease in price has brought more demanders into the market. And so our new equilibrium quantity is bigger. Quantity has gone up. The equilibrium price is lower. Because of the increase in supply, it's cheaper to produce. More units are going to be produced and sold. That's our new equilibrium quantity. Quantity supplied now equals quantity demanded at a new lower price because it's cheaper. And that should make sense, right? It should make sense that if it's cheaper to produce, the price is going to be lower, and when the price is lower, more people are going to buy it. If you ever get an answer that doesn't make sense when you've shifted supply and demand, you've done something wrong. Because if you get an answer that doesn't make sense, that's saying, well, it should always make sense because you live in markets, right? So imagine, real quick, imagine if you were answering this question and you had your original equilibrium price and quantity, P0 star, Q0 star, and then you said, okay, new technology, it's cost less to produce, so supply increases, and let's suppose you accidentally drew supply like that. You thought supply increases, and you, very, very common mistake when you're first learning supply and demand. You shift supply in the wrong direction, you're thinking increase and you're thinking up, but as we know, this is not an increase in supply. This is a decrease. This is a contraction of supply. This is a shift in the supply curve. But let's just say that you did it incorrectly. I just want to emphasize in case you're looking at that's not correct. But you don't know that. You just did it. You shifted the supply and you say, okay, my new equilibrium is at where the new supply curve intersects the original demand curve. And so my new equilibrium is here. And so you would be saying that price is now higher and quantity is lower. Again, this is not right. I don't want you. That doesn't make any sense, right? So think about it. You say, oh, it costs less to produce. People are more willing to supply. It's an increase in supply. So my new equilibrium, when it costs less to make, my new equilibrium is at a higher price and fewer people are buying it. It costs less to make these things, so the price has risen and fewer people are buying. That doesn't make any sense. And so whenever you're shifting demand or shifting supply and you say, oh, here's my new equilibrium, think about if that makes sense. Because if it doesn't, you've probably shifted something wrong because you've lived in markets your whole life. So you understand what you would expect to happen. Oh, it's cheaper to produce. They're going to be cheaper to buy. And if they're cheaper to buy, more people will buy them. That's what happens. Always think about if your answer makes sense, not just in this class, everywhere. If you're answering something, particularly if you're doing math or using graphs or something like that, think about if your answer makes sense. And if it doesn't, go back and figure out what you did wrong.